This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to a homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click this big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is part of a series generously sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which includes a focus on global affairs and the international world order.
And we're pleased to welcome back to the show Professor Rashid Khalidi, speaking to us from New York City. You may have noticed that we have gone remote in these days of Corona. We want to tell you where our guests are from. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He has a BA from Yale, a PhD from Oxford. He is co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, and he was the president of the Middle East Studies Association. He was also an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. And for our purposes, most importantly, he's the author of 7 books prior to the latest one, which we will be discussing today. It's called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, published by Metropolitan Books in 2020. Rashid Khalidi, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thanks for having me back.
So I want to open up by talking about the form or format of this book. You are writing this book as a historian, but not only. You've woven in a family memoir, making this rather personal. It's not just somebody's history or even the people's history. It's also your personal history. Why did you decide to develop the book in this way? Were you trying to, in some way, challenge the historiography of the conflict as well as historical ideas?
Well, I was under the influence of my son in particular, who said to me that he thought I had written enough academic dry monographs, and that it was time to write something a little more personal and to bring in some of my own experiences, some of the stuff that I would use as sources, but in a different way, including family material. And so I reluctantly and with difficulty acceded to this suggestion, which he helped me devise the structure for the book. And I was trying to challenge a certain kind of historiography at the same time, and I don't know if that succeeds, because I'm making an argument that many historians don't find terribly controversial, but that many other people probably will. And at the same time, I'm trying to make this a narrative that's approachable and relatable for people who are not maybe academics or specialists or historians.
What is the thing you think historians do not find controversial, but the general reader might?
Well, I mean, in the very title, this argument that this is a struggle that involves settler colonialism. This would not have been something that would have been controversial to anybody in the issue of in the 1920s or 1930s. They understood that this was at the same time that they saw it as a national project, that it was a colonial project. The word colonial was commonly used as a self-description. But it's something that in the wake of the establishment of Israel and in the post-Nakba era is banished from, actually in the post-World War II era, is banished from people's consciousness. And it's now seen as almost an insult or a slur to suggest that this is not just a national renewal project, or however Zionism wants to self-describe, but rather was and is a settler colonial project.
But isn't it more a question of semantics than actual historiography? Because, it's the evolution of the socio-political context of colonialism, after decolonization, etc. It's not so much the facts themselves, but how you interpret them.
Well, I think that the point that I try and make here is that this is a common process for successful settler colonial projects, which is to say that they normalize, they become national. The United States is a settler colonial project. I'm sitting here looking at an island called Manhattan. I'm looking out my window at an island that was called Manhattan. That's not an Anglo-Saxon name. That's a Native American name. This is a settler colonial project. It's a successful one. There is an American national entity that was created by it. There's an Israeli national entity that was created by the Zionist project. There's nothing in that, i.e., there's nothing contradictory between the idea that a settler colonial project should become a successful national project.
How many of those are there these days? I'm trying to think. I mean, after decolonization, how many countries can you look at around the world and say this country is the product of colonialism and is still governed or inhabited primarily by the colonists?
Mainly white Anglo-Saxon settler colonies, New Zealand, Australia, United States, and Canada. You could argue that one of the rare cases where a settler colonial project was fundamentally revised would be South Africa and maybe some East African countries, which were originally meant to be white settler colonies and have developed in a different fashion. But those are the only ones. Right. I argue in the book that Zionism is unique, and the struggle between the Zionist project and the Palestinians is unique in many other different ways. I mean, for one thing, you don't have a Bible in South Africa or North America.
Well, let's go back to some of
there are many other reasons for the differences. You don't have a people that's a direct extension of the metropole the way you do in France or North America. British subjects come to North America. French citizens go to North Africa, and they see those colonies as extensions of the mother country. The settlers who come to Palestine are trying to set up something completely separate from they have no mother country, as it were. So it's unique in many, many respects, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we'll talk about some of the ways in which it's unique. And I want to go back to what you said in the beginning, which is that in the early years of the Zionist project, that would not have been a controversial thing to say. And I noticed that in the introduction, you cite Zev Jabotinsky from 1923, referring to the Palestinian Arabs as trying to resist colonization, in his words. Right. So the question is, do you think that by that he meant it in the way we mean it today, which is in a negative, pejorative sense, like what a terrible thing, this is colonialism, and of course they're trying to resist it? Or would he have said, yes, we're a colonial project because we are desperate for a state, and that's the way states are built? It's either that or territorial conquest, and we can't do territorial conquest, so this is what we're going to do.
No, he would have said just what you said. He did say it.
Isn't it great that I've become a spokesperson for Jabotinsky?
The other thing about Jabotinsky and his brutal honesty was, and I mean, you can find multiple statements of his to this effect, is that, first of all, as you suggested, he said, we have no alternative. We have to do this. We need an iron wall provided by somebody else to enable us to establish this colonial endeavor, but that, of course, this is our country, it belongs to us, and we have no alternative. The other point to make about Jabotinsky and people in the 20s and 30s is that this was the high age of European colonialism. European colonialism was still extending in the post-World War I era after Versailles. The colonial powers extended their grip over the world, and
but not so much
was
settler
still
colonialism,
fashionable.
Right?
Pardon me?
Not so much settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, by and large, is an earlier phenomenon, isn't it?
That's correct. That is correct. In fact, Zionism is the last gasp of white European settler colonialism. And as Tony Judd said, it sort of missed the bus. It comes later than all the ones that were much more successful and much earlier. I mean, they start here in the 17th century in North America. They start in Australia in the 18th century. In Palestine, late 19th. So it is in that respect an anomaly. But as late as the 20s and 30s, colonialism was still not in bad odor. It was only really after World War II in the era of decolonization that the world changed. And Zionism changed its tune, partly because there'd been this conflict with the British, starting with the 1939 White Paper. Until that point, Zionism was the coddled stepchild of British colonialism. However much they cavilled and complained about the British not doing enough, without British support, the Zionist project could not have established itself in Palestine in the 20s and 30s, right up to 1939. And at that point, the conflict with the British led Zionists to see themselves as fighting colonialism. And so it worked perfectly for them. In the era of decolonization, they could say, we are fighting British colonialism. It was a wonderful transformation for them.
The interesting thing about the way you tell the historical narrative in your book, you divide it into chapters. Each is called a declaration of war from a different year. And you can look at least at two declarations and wars and victories that were phenomenal from an Israeli point of view. That's the establishment of Israel in 1948 with the expulsion of a great chunk of the Palestinian indigenous population. And 1967, that was also the Six-Day War, of course, a remarkable victory. Why weren't these remarkable victories decisive enough to say, okay, to deliver a death blow to the Palestinians?
That's actually a really good question. And I think that most people for a long time after 1948 would have assumed that that victory did exactly what you said, that it had finished Palestine. When Golda Meir says in 1969, there is no Palestine, there never was, she is sharing a common assumption. We've won, they're gone, it's over. Among many Israelis. They were dealing with the Arab countries. They thought that that was the only conflict they had to really resolve in their favor, that the one with the Palestinians had been settled in 1948. They were wrong, it turns out, because the Palestinian national movement revives in the late 50s and 60s. I touch on that in the book, and many historians have talked about it, starting with Yehoshua Porat way back when, and many others since then, Israeli, Palestinian, and other. 67, actually, ironically, gives a boost to Palestinian nationalism, even as it is an enormous, quote-unquote, victory for Israel. It also is a victory for Palestinian nationalism. Again, this is irony, but there we are.
I think you said, I just have to quote it because it was so succinct. You said a central paradox of 1967 is that by defeating the Arabs, Israel resurrected the Palestinians. That's a very powerful statement. How did that actually happen?
Well, many people in the Arab world assumed that the negative outcomes of 1948 would somehow be changed positively by the Arab governments, whether Abdel Nasser in Egypt or whether the Ba'ath regime in Syria or whoever, that these problems would be redressed. In the minds of some people, it would mean the destruction of Israel. In the minds of some people, it would mean a return to the 47 frontiers, whatever it might mean. And the Palestinians were sort of not the ones who were seen as having their destiny in their own hands. This was a Palestinian assertion that was going on at that time, a development of a revived Palestinian national movement that said, no, we have to do it ourselves. But most Arabs, most people in the Arab world in the Middle East, felt that the Arab governments were responsible. And the Arab governments were shown to be weak and incompetent by the results of the 1967 war, where 3 Arab armies were decisively defeated in just a few days by the Israeli military.
So I think to understand the roots of that revival, now that we're at 67, I want to go back to the early part of the 20th century when you chronicle in part through your own family, the emergence of a Palestinian national identity, the one that has been so roundly denied by Israeli leaders and their supporters over the years. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how Palestinian Arabs at the time saw the emergence of that national identity. Why do you say that contradicts the Zionist narratives so decisively?
Well, I mean, this is a topic I've written on a couple of places.
That's why you're here.
Books, right? And it's based on an understanding of nationalism that is not well regarded by nationalists, whether Israeli, whether Zionists, or whether Palestinian, or for that matter, Arab nationalists or any other nationalists. Because my understanding of nationalism is that it's a very modern phenomenon. My understanding is that even though it incorporates pre-existing elements of identity, religion or attachment to place or whatever language, it is a new phenomenon. The idea that the polity has to be made up of people who are similar nationally, have the same language, and so on and so forth. That's a modern concept. It didn't exist in the 17th, 16th century. The British don't bring a German and put him on the throne because he's a national. They bring him because he's a Protestant, and it doesn't matter that he's a German. And before that, they brought a Dutchman in 1688. So the national principle, even in the most developed, later on developed nations, is not fully established until much, much later than most people assume. And that's true with Palestine. The idea that you are a Palestinian above being a Muslim or a Jerusalemite or a member of this or that family simply didn't exist in 1700 or 1800 or even probably into the late 19th century. And that's true for Zionism as well. Zionism is a minority ideology in the 19th century, late 19th century when it develops. Most Jews don't think that they belong to a nation state that has to be established in their ancestral homeland of the land of Israel. That's a new concept in the late 19th century, and not a majority concept. So I trace in different work that I've done how Palestinian national consciousness develops, and the elements of what I call overlapping identities, out of which it develops. And it really doesn't take off until the 20th century, any more than does Zionism, for that matter. I mean, you have 4 million Jews coming to the United States and tens of thousands coming to Palestine. And people voted with their feet. The ones who believed in Zionism sincerely came to Palestine. The ones who didn't either stayed in Russia or stayed in Eastern Europe or came to the United States. And I would argue that over time that changes, and that those beliefs constitute realities. I mean, national reality is a real thing. But the ideas that people hold as members of the quote unquote nation are very often myths, fabrications, distortions, and so on.
The interesting thing about looking at it from a settler colonial perspective is that it allows us to go beyond the actual existence or non-existence of the national consciousness and look at, politics in terms of, power, of political power. Mm-hmm. And the Jews, the Zionists, however downtrodden and poor and persecuted they were, still enjoyed to a certain degree the support of international powers that allowed them to develop this disparity of power with the Palestinians. Is that really the thing that put the conflict in motion in your view?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I describe what happens in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration as a declaration of war on the Palestinians. Herzl hawked the Zionist project all around Europe. He went to the Ottoman Sultan, he went to the German Kaiser, he went to the French. He was unsuccessful. It was only when Weizmann managed to win the support of the British during World War I that the project really takes off. I mean, you have settlers and you have settlements, colonies in Palestine before the Balfour Declaration. But until you have a great power setting this at the center of its Middle East policy and putting troops and money and power behind it, that this project takes off. So yes, absolutely. And this comes to a crunch in the late 30s when the Palestinians finally rise up, and from 36 to 39, and the British bring in over 100,000 soldiers and the Royal Air Force, and they crush the Palestinians. And without that, Israel would not have been created. There's no question that the support of the greatest power of the age in those 2 decades after World War I was essential, the essential precondition for the establishment of the State of Israel. This is not an entirely controversial argument. I mean, Tom Segev makes the same argument in his book, One Palestine Complete.
Right, but I think that what seems to me another underlying theme of the book, even if I'm not sure if you intended for it to be, but it seems to me that it stands out, which is that the Palestinian Arabs of the time, in the attempt to kind of consolidate and assert their national identity, faced a struggle at every angle. Right. In other words, it was obvious that the Zionists would try to deny that their national identity, but the British, as you say, make war on them. And then later on, you also document how the Arab states were not too keen to recognize their national identity, specifically King Abdullah of Jordan, who extended his generous offer to put them under his protection after 48. They said, no, your family members were intimately involved in that, and it was like an assertion of Palestinian leadership that we need to forge our own identity that was not particularly welcome. Why? Why was that such a struggle when other nations were coming into being through the first half of the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century and being recognized as such? Why do the Palestinians constantly have to make the case that we are a nation unto ourselves, not just one of the Arab world?
Well, it's a combination of factors. One is the consistent support of external powers, what we've already talked about, not just the British. During World War II, the world changes and the great superpowers become the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Zionist movement, to its credit, cultivates its links with both, such that when push comes to shove in the post-World War II era, it has the support of both superpowers. Partition doesn't pass without the Americans and the Russians strong-arming it through the General Assembly, forcing client states, forcing weak countries to vote for it. Israel doesn't get established without both military support and diplomatic support and so on from both superpowers. So there's that, and that continues. But as you suggest, There's also other problems for the Palestinians, one of them being the lack of support from the Arab countries, and in many cases, the active opposition of the Arab countries, notably, as you mentioned, King Abdullah. Abdullah was always hostile to Palestinian nationalism because his ambitions included expanding his domain westwards into Palestine, northwards into Syria, and if possible, eastwards into Iraq. He always felt that he'd gotten the short end of the stick when Winston Churchill distributed the goodies after World War I. And he wanted as much as he could get of Palestine. He was the only Arab ruler who welcomed the 1937 partition plan. Privately,
47.
He welcomed it.
You mean the Peel Commission of 37 or the partition?
Exactly, the Peel Commission partition plan of 1937. He was perfectly happy with the 1947 partition plan. I recount an incident that my father told me about in 1947, at the very moment when the partition plan was adopted by the General Assembly. And he cut a deal, or tried to cut a deal, with the Zionist movement, with the Jewish Agency, in the person of Moshe Sharett and Golda Meir, with whom he negotiated at great length how they would sort things out in Palestine. So he was fundamentally opposed to Palestinian nationalism because of his own territorial ambitions. The problem with the other Arab countries was that sometimes they actually opposed the Palestinians. So Palestinians fought the Syrians, for example, in the 70s. Libyan and Iraqi intelligence services killed many, many, many Palestinian leaders. But the other problem was their rivalries nullified any possibility of their extending unified support to the Palestinians or doing anything vis-a-vis Israel. So the
either they
Palestinians
directly
faced all
fought
of those problems.
So it's like either they directly fought against the Palestinians, or because they were fighting against each other, the Palestinians became the pawn.
Exactly.
Great.
And that's again another spur to Palestinian nationalism. That's one reason that in the wake of 1967. The Palestinian national movement takes over the PLO, which had been established by Egypt to master and control rising Palestinian nationalism. The Palestinians take it over, and as they say, the rest is history.
Was there anything that the Palestinians could have done to improve their diplomatic standing? Maybe not as much as the Zionists, who really, as you say, excelled at it. But do you think that the Palestinians were perhaps a bit too passive at times?
Passive? Or wait, I want to sharpen that question. I want to pile on to that question.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like as the Palestinian leadership was emerging and again sort of forming itself in the 50s and 60s, they generally used military strategies, whether it was raids inside Israel or, as you put it, I think later, commando groups in the lead up to 67. So maybe if you can put the two halves of our question together and say, did the strategy they chose work? Or could they have done more on the diplomatic and international scene, and done? Would the results have been different or better? I know that's a counterfactual, but
or was it just a lost cause?
Well, I think that the outcome was overdetermined. If you're going up against the great power of the age for the better part of a century, it's very unusual that you're going to win. No colonized people won its independence between World War I and World War II, except the Irish. In the entire colonized world, nobody won except the Irish. So, you would have had to have been exceptionally gifted as a national movement to defeat colonialism in the interwar period. And as I say, only the Irish did so in 1922. As far as could they have done things differently? Of course they could have done things differently. The reasons why they didn't are laid out in the book, but there were many moments when better choices could have been made, when better strategies could have been adopted and should have been adopted.
Like what? Can you give us a few examples?
Details.
Or just a couple of examples?
Well,
maybe.
sure. For example, in the Middle East, in the interwar period, no country freed itself that was under external rule, as were most of them, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, all of them. None of them freed themselves of colonial rule, but the ones that revolted right after World War I, the Iraqis and the Egyptians in particular, got some form of independence. They forced the British to give them something. The Palestinians didn't rise until 1936. Big mistake. They should have acted much, much earlier. And they might have gotten a change in these extremely unfavorable circumstances imposed on them by the Mandate for Palestine. I could give you other examples. They shouldn't have rejected the 1939 White Paper. Britain was a declining force in 1939, but still, it would have put them in a different position. And most of the Palestinian leadership was in favor of accepting. It was only the Mufti, sitting in exile in Beirut at the time, who opposed accepting the White Paper. So there are many other examples I could give.
And what about after the war, though, after the establishment of Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the same question applies in a way?
then you come to the question of the question that you asked at the end
Yeah.
of diplomacy versus force. It's a brutal reality that had the Palestinians not resorted to force, they probably wouldn't have forced themselves on the attention of the world. The policies of hijackings, the policies of terrorist attacks, you can call them whatever you want, commando operations, terrorist attacks.
I was
whatever,
using your language.
on civilians or on military targets, which were militarily and strategically completely unsuccessful, succeeded in putting the Palestinians back, as it were, on the map. Unfortunately, it also helped to picture them as terrorists. But that then was turned by the PLO into the springboard for a diplomatic offensive that was actually quite successful in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The Palestinians became a recognized actor on the world stage after decades in which Israel and the United States and others had assumed they had been eliminated. There was no Palestine. There were no Palestinians. There was a refugee issue. The resolution adopted after the 1967 war doesn't mention the Palestine question or Palestine or the Palestinians. It's just resolution of the refugee problem. Which refugees? Who are they? Do they have an identity? Do they have political demands? Not mentioned. It's a refugee problem. It's a humanitarian issue. That's the status of the Palestinians in 1967 internationally. Soviet Union voted for that resolution. Britain, France, United States, China voted for that resolution. So getting themselves to where they are recognized by over 100 and whatever it is countries, that their leader addresses the General Assembly in 1974, is an extraordinary change from the situation between 1948 and 1967. So that was a diplomatic strategy that I argue in the book was actually quite successful.
And regardless of diplomatic strategies, there was, maybe an unwitting one, which was, dare I say, the Intifadas that actually changed the perception of the Palestinians among public opinion in the West, but not so much thanks to diplomatic efforts on the part of the leadership, but because that's, the way it was. Do you think that it was really a watershed, or?
I do. The first Intifada was. The second Intifada was a disaster for the Palestinians. I described the first Intifada, the one that started in December 1987, as one of the few Palestinian successes, because, as you say, it accurately portrayed the conflict as one not between an Arab Goliath and poor, tiny, innocent little Israel under siege, but much more correctly, as the Palestinians alone in the field, unarmed, against this colossus, which is the Israeli occupation. So a little boy throwing a stone against a tank is an image which doesn't exactly sum things up, but it sums it up a hell of a lot better than the way in which the conflict had been portrayed by Zionist propaganda over generations, which is poor, tiny little Israel, all the Arabs are going to destroy it. By this stage, by the time the Intifada has come about, Egypt is at peace with Israel. Jordan has been collaborating with Israel since before Israel was established. Most Arab countries are busy with their problems. Israel faces no actual existential threat from the region and is beating up on the Palestinians. And so the media image that emerges from the first Intifada, in my view, is an enormous victory for the Palestinians.
And were they able to
sustain? But you're also right. It's not something that's premeditated or a result of strategy. It's a result of a spontaneous uprising.
Yeah, but do you think that the Palestinian leadership capitalized on it in a way that served it well?
It seems like at the moment of the Intifada, it led to the Palestinian leadership, or I should say the PLO leadership, at that time, what was the Tunis leadership, to change their attitude, or at least their public-facing demands for Palestinian self-determination and formalize the demand for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, as opposed to all the other phases that you document, in which the first phase was establishing an all-Palestinian state, a Palestinian Arab state, and then after that, one democratic state. And this was sort of an evolution. Do you think that the Intifada kind of galvanized or somehow catalyzed that change of national self-determination goal?
And also, more importantly, allow the Palestinian leadership to speak openly about engaging with the Israeli government?
Yeah, I think that all of what's implied in the question is essentially correct, which is to say that the Palestinian leadership is able, the PLO leadership is able to come out, as it were, with their true intentions much more openly after the Intifada. And the 1988 Declaration of Independence is proof of what you're saying. However, anybody who looks closely at the actual evolution of what was going on inside Palestinian politics, as distinct from the entirely false vision of it that's portrayed by Israeli government apologists, which is the Palestinians are bloodthirsty terrorists who want to destroy us. They have no objective other than that. Anybody who looks at reality rather than this false construct will see that that's an evolution that ends, as you say, in 1988, but which really begins in the immediate aftermath of the 73 war, with the Palestinian National Council taking a series of resolutions starting in 74, which adapts to and accepts the idea of a two-state solution. So they were already going in that direction. The Intifada gives them the platform, as it were, to come out much more openly for a diplomatic resolution of the conflict. In fact, we know that they're begging to get into the diplomatic game much before this, as early as the mid 70s.
Right? You document that. I just think it's interesting that I want to challenge you a little bit, because in the book, you describe two particular, in addition to other events, that were parts of the war on Palestine, and I'm referring specifically to 242, to UN Security Council Resolution 242, and the Oslo process, both of which were considered wars on Palestine in your reading, but which today are considered the cornerstone of the legitimization for what many at least in the Israeli camp, consider the road to peace, which is a two-state solution. So why are those wars on Palestine, if they could have actually advanced the idea of a two-state solution eventually, even if they didn't say so specifically at the time?
Well, 242 doesn't do what you're saying. 242 does not set out the basis for a two-state solution.
No, but it does lay the formula of land for peace and negotiations.
Yeah, but it is meant to be a negotiation between Israel and the Arab states, and they're the only actors that are envisaged in 242A. And B, given the escape clause that's written into it, the territories occupied,
territories without the word the. That's the whole problem.
Exactly. Territories occupied in the English version of the resolution, which is the definitive one as far as the only power that matters, which is the United States, is concerned. Israel is enabled to keep the occupied territories for 53 years and counting. So it is not a basis for 242 was not a resolution on the basis of which a just and lasting peace involving return of territories occupied in 1967 could have been made, and wasn't meant to be. It was crafted in close coordination between the United States and Israeli diplomats to give Israel all the leeway to extract whatever it wanted from the Arab states, while not necessarily giving back, and in fact, in the case of Palestinian territories, not giving back the territories that were occupied in 1967, whether to Jordan or to anybody else. I mean, we have since, I don't talk about this in the book, but we have since, from the Israeli side, seen multiple revelations of how often the Israelis stonewalled Jordan when it tried to, starting right after 1967 and going on for well over a decade, when it tried to negotiate the return of the Jordanian-controlled, the previously Jordanian-controlled territories that were occupied in 1967. So 242 is not that. The Oslo process had that potential, or might have had. I wouldn't say the Oslo process. The Madrid process might have had that potential. But again, as I write in the book, as I suggest in the book, and in another book I wrote specifically about Madrid-Oslo, there are various hidden time bombs written into the letter of invitation, the letters of the assurances given to the various parties, and the ground rules, which in effect meant that you could not have a Palestinian state, or rather Israel could prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state with the full approval of the United States.
Okay, so how do we start to tie this all together? We've exposed the myths. We've, tried to expose the war, or you've tried to expose the war, what you consider a war against Palestine. And what do you think the Palestinian National Movement should do now? You point out a few directions in the conclusion. One of them I think is particularly interesting, which is you argue for the effectiveness of making the parallels between the Palestinian situation and other conflicts or colonial conflicts or other kinds of conflicts in the world. How do you think that we take the information that you've been examining and leverage it to point out the way forward?
Well, I'm a historian. I'm not a politician.
I know, but I'm a political strategist, so I get to ask questions like that.
No, of course, it's a perfectly legitimate question. But I don't think that I have the answer to the political question. If I did, I would be a politician and, probably fail like most politicians. But I think that what I try and lay out here is the arguments that should be made. I think that arguing how many states can dance on the head of a pin is futile. We have a one-state reality created by Israel, carefully crafted by Israel over 53 years. starting with the first decisions made after the occupation is made by labor governments and continuing especially with a special vengeance and power with the governments dominated by Likud from 77 onwards. And that's a reality that could be changed backwards. What Tony Judd once said, what any politician has done, another politician can undo, is of course true. You could rewind and extract 600, 700,000 settlers from the occupied territories. You could, take apart the matrix of control. But I don't think that's likely to happen. I think we have a one-state reality. And the question is, what kind of state is that going to be? Is it going to be the kind of discriminatory, repressive state dominated by what is probably now a minority of the total population of Palestine between the river and the sea? Or is it going to be a different kind of polity? Now, how you get to where you don't have discrimination and where, whether you're born in New York or Amman or whatever, you want to be a citizen of this thing, you can come there, and not only this group can go and not that group can't. How you get to that, I don't know. I really don't know. I have no idea. But I think that the arguments that I lay out against the status quo are arguments that at least should be considered by anybody who is engaged in trying to change that status quo.
Do you think that the misconception about all those issues in the public opinion in the West is really what prevents things from moving forward? And perhaps with your book, you're endeavoring in a way to try and change that?
I think what Gilad's trying to say is there a polemical aspect to your book?
No.
No.
Okay.
Let him answer.
Let me answer. I sincerely believe that in spite of the national reality that Zionism has created, in spite of the independent, separate existence of an Israeli nation state, that the project was and is, always was and still is, dependent on external support. Israel doesn't do what it does without external support. It doesn't operate as it operates without the incredible economic exchange with the EU, without the incredible technological and military and especially financial support from the private sector in this country, not just from the U.S. government, that it enjoys. Changing that external situation for Israel changes that balance. The Palestinians, of course, as I argue in the book very, very forcefully, have to get their act together. It's not just a matter of changing the situation abroad in Europe and the United States. It's not just a matter of changing opinion inside Israel or changing the balance. You have to change the balance of forces between the Palestinians and Israel, which is entirely or largely in Israel's favor right now and has been for a very long time. And to do that, the Palestinians have to reform, reestablish, regenerate their national movement, which is in a parlous, terrible state right now, and have to clarify their strategic objectives, which is something that is sorely lacking right now. And they also have to go back to some of the strategies that served them in the past, which is appealing to people around the world and also appealing to Israelis, which they utterly fail to do in the current circumstance, which doesn't mean, quote unquote, normalization. What it means is making a case for Palestine to Israelis that Israelis can understand in Hebrew. The people who are closest to being able to do that are Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. They're the ones who understand Zionism better than anybody else. They all speak Hebrew. They grew up in Israel. They're Israelis. Some of them are more Israeli than other Israelis. But that, whether with their leadership or through an evolution of consciousness, that's going to have to happen among the Palestinians.
So they can be the bridge. You think the Palestinian citizens of Israel can be the bridge?
They are the bridge. They already are. They already are. I mean, everything we know, much of what we know, we've learned from either poets from inside Israel or literary figures or politics. I mean, the role that they've already played in expanding Palestinian understanding of Israel and Zionism is enormous, and they'll do much more of that in the future, whether legally or in terms of their involvement in Israeli politics or whatever. But to go back to the core of the question, I sincerely believe that Israel is, in some fundamental ways, dependent on the liberal democracies in the West, and that Israel is an increasingly illiberal country, and has increasingly moved towards a kind of discrimination that is fundamentally unacceptable to liberal democracies. Now, there are countries in the West that have ceased to be liberal democracies. Poland and Austria and Hungary are moving rapidly away from liberal democracy. Trump does not represent a liberal democratic trend in the United States. Quite the contrary. Those trends may rise in the future If they do, then Israel is in a great position. It already has wonderful relations with the most autocratic countries on earth, Russia and China, and increasingly illiberal democracy in India.
Brazil, India, don't forget.
I could go on and on. I mean, all of the countries I mentioned, Israel has excellent relations with. All of the Eastern European countries that are moving to the right. But ultimately, it is dependent on Western Europe and the United States in some ways, some fundamental ways. If opinion, as and when opinion changes here, and it is changing in the United States, there is absolutely no question that it is changing in the Jewish community, among young people, among minorities, among the base of the Democratic Party, even among the ossified, long-standing supporters of Israel who control and lead the Democratic Party and fund the Democratic Party. Even among those people, there are changes.
Even they read the polls.
Yeah, as those evolutions take place, in spite of the pushback, the money and the power that's inserted into trying to turn Palestinian activism into anti-Semitism or frame it as but the incredible efforts in Europe to shut down any discussion of Palestine. In spite of that, there is fundamental change going on, okay. And as and when that happens, Israel is going to have a real problem. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's going to be a very important factor.
Well, change is on its way somehow. We don't know what form it will take, but in the meantime, I want to thank you. That's Professor Rashid Khalidi, who's been speaking to us from New York. Thank you for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
And a big thanks to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We like good ones, bad ones, annoyed ones. Yeah. You all can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.